Imagine an intelligence that is vast enough to name, track, and, sustain billions of burning galaxies.
Right, a mind that holds the actual physics of the universe together.
Yeah. Orchestrating the trajectory of every comet, the precise nuclear fusion of every star. But then imagine that same infinite intelligence suddenly stopping all of that cosmic management just to get down on his knees, sit on the sidewalk, and carefully bandage the scraped knee of a discarded, forgotten outcast.
It's a staggering paradox.
It really is. The tension between that supreme cosmic sovereignty and this intimate, condescending tenderness, and that tension is the heart of today's deep dive here on formed thinking.
And it's a paradox that completely shatters how we, usually define greatness. I mean, human leaders consider themselves great based on how far they are elevated above the mundane.
Right, the higher you go up the corporate ladder.
Yeah, the more insulated you become from the granular suffering on the ground. You aren't dealing with the painful details. But the source material we are looking at today argues the complete opposite regarding God.
We're looking at Charles Spurgeon's exposition of Psalm 147 from the Treasury of David.
Yes, alongside commentaries from various naturalists and theologians. And it presents a creator who is so immense that nothing is great to him, yet so fiercely attentive that nothing is little to him.
I want you, the listener, to think about it like a scientist trying to look through a Hubble telescope and a stethoscope at the exact same time.
Oh, that is a great image.
It feels like an impossible tension, right?
Yeah.
How can the same hands that marshal the astronomical hosts be the hands that apply, soft bandages to bleeding spiritual wounds?
It's hard to wrap your mind around.
It is. So today we are going to look at how this plays out, not just in theology, but in the physical anatomy of a broken heart, the brutal winters we face, and even the bizarre biology of grass growing in the freezing Swiss Alps. We are going to challenge how you view the seemingly random events of your own life, from the grief you might be carrying right now to the weather outside your window.
So to start, the exposition begins with a call to praise, a hallelujah, simply because praising God is good, pleasant, and fitting.
Which makes sense.
Right. But it doesn't stay in the abstract for very long. The text immediately grounds this praise in a specific action. It pictures God acting as an architect and a builder of Jerusalem.
Okay.
And the text says, He gathers together the outcasts. The commentators draw a direct line between the historical moment of Nehemiah repairing the physical ruined walls of Jerusalem with literal broken stones.
Right.
And David in the wilderness gathering a band of outcasts, men who were, in distress and debt and discontented.
Let's stop right there and look at this building method because, humanly speaking, it makes absolutely zero sense.
None at all.
If you are building a magnificent city or a global enterprise, human logic dictates that you select the best materials available.
Right, you want the brightest minds.
The most polished resumes, the pristine marble. You actively avoid the broken, the banished, and the ruined. So if I'm trying to build something that lasts, why would I intentionally go to the scrap heap? It feels counterintuitive to the point of being reckless.
It does seem reckless, yeah. Especially if you evaluate it through the lens of human meritocracy. But the commentary from theologians like Stephen Charnock explains the precise logic behind this.
What does he say?
He argues that God choosing the outcasts is a deliberate demonstration of his sovereign skill. Charnock points out that there are none of his people so despised in the eyes of society, but they are known and regarded by God.
Wow.
In fact, Charnock uses this brilliant phrase. He notes that although these outcasts are clouded and despised by the world, they are actually the stars of the world.
The stars of the world.
Yeah. By selecting the broken and the ruined, the builder ensures that the glory of the finished structure comes entirely from the maker's skill, not the innate quality of the materials.
I see. It's like a master craftsman working with reclaimed wood.
Yes, precisely.
A truly brilliant carpenter doesn't prove his skill by going to a high-end store and buying a prefabricated, flawless piece of furniture. Anyone with enough money can do that. A true master takes shattered, weather-beaten, discarded wood full of nails and rot that everyone else threw away, and he sands it down, planes it, and turns it into a breathtaking masterpiece.
Yeah.
The worse the material starts out, the more it highlights the genius of the carpenter.
That analogy captures it perfectly. If the church were built with spiritual stones that were already polished and perfect, humanity would praise the stones.
Right. We'd say, look at how great these people are.
Yeah, we would assume these people were chosen because of their intrinsic value or moral superiority. But by gathering the outcasts, those who are morally, socially, or spiritually bankrupt, God makes it undeniable that the strength and beauty of the city are entirely his doing.
It requires an infinitely capable hand to build an eternal city out of banished people.
It does. And this concept sets the stage for everything else we will discuss today. God is drawn to the broken.
And if God's building project requires broken materials, that brings up a massive question. How does he handle the brokenness of the individuals he gathers?
Because it's one thing to pick up a broken stone and another to handle a human soul.
Exactly. There is a huge difference. The source material moves directly into this,
Yeah.
stating that God healeth the broken in heart and bindeth up their wounds.
And the commentary here brings in a 17th century writer named William Fenner.
Yeah.
He provides this incredibly intense clinical diagnosis of what a broken heart actually is. But interestingly, before he talks about the broken heart, he talks about the danger of having a whole heart.
Right, which sounds weird.
He describes mankind naturally starting with a whole heart in sin.
What does he mean by a whole heart? Usually we think of a whole heart as a good thing, like being healthy.
Fenner's diagnostic language is fascinating because it turns our modern psychological assumptions upside down. When Fenner talks about a whole heart in sin, he is referring to the natural, unregenerate state of humanity.
Okay.
A whole heart, in this context, is a heart that is completely unified in its rebellion. It feels no friction, no guilt, no conviction, no sorrow over its condition. It is entirely comfortable in its fallen state.
So it's not a healthy whole, it's a pure.
It's a desperate, fatal disease. He argues this unbroken state is like a patient who has a deadly tumor but feels absolutely no pain.
Oh, wow.
The lack of pain is not a sign of health. It is the reason the patient will not seek a physician.
So the wholeness is an illusion. It's a fatal numbness.
Yes. And before the physician can apply healing, that dangerous numbness, that fatal wholeness must be shattered.
Right.
Fenner explains the mechanism of how God breaks the heart. He says the law acts like a hammer. The moral demands of God's law strike the human conscience, breaking it with the terrifying realization of guilt and impending judgment.
The law shatters the illusion that we are good people.
Precisely. It proves we can't stand on our own merit.
Wait, I have to push back on that process for a second.
Sure.
If a heart is just smashed with a hammer, it is destroyed. If you hit a piece of glass with a hammer, you don't heal the glass, you obliterate it into 1,000 unrecoverable pieces.
Yeah, it's true.
If the goal is healing, how does terrifying someone with the law result in anything other than absolute despair?
That is the critical turning point in Fenner's theology. If the process stopped with the hammer of the law, it would indeed lead only to destruction and despair. But Fenner notes that while the law breaks the heart with guilt, the gospel breaks it with mercy.
The gospel breaks it, not just the law.
Yes. The realization of grace, the sheer unmerited compassion of the physician bleeding for the patient, shatters the heart in a completely different way. It produces genuine repentance rather than just terror. The hammer of the law produces a legal fear of punishment, but the warmth of the gospel melts the heart into a filial, loving sorrow.
So it's a completely different kind of brokenness.
Exactly. The heart is broken from its sin by the law, but it is broken for its sin by the gospel. And Fenner is adamant that Jesus is the specific physician appointed for this exact malady.
He's the only one who can handle it.
Yeah, he uses a striking historical contrast. He mentions the Roman Emperor Trajan, who supposedly died at the hands of his own physician. Fenner contrasts this by stating that Christ never loses a patient. He is perfectly appointed to bind up the specific wounds he has allowed the law to open.
You know, the rhetorical drop that happens right after this
Right.
in the text is an absolute shock to this system.
Oh, from stars to size.
Yes, from stars to size. We go from this intimate, bleeding psychological surgery straight into the cosmos. Right after talking about binding up wounds, the text says, He telleth the number of the stars, he calleth them all by their names.
It is a jarring transition.
To put it in modern terms, it's as if the CEO of a multi-trillion-dollar global supply chain walked out of a boardroom where they were managing the logistics of continents, just to sit on the sidewalk, pull out a first aid kit, and carefully bandage the scraped knee of a street child.
That transition is entirely deliberate. The biblical authors frequently juxtapose these extremes to force us to expand our theology.
Because we like to put God in a box.
We do. We either view him as a distant cosmic force who spun the universe into existence but cares nothing for our individual lives,
Right.
or we view him as a personal therapist who is very attentive to our feelings but lacks the sovereign muscle to actually change the circumstances of the universe. The text fuses the two.
It's both at once.
Yes, his infinite understanding bridges the macro and the micro. He doesn't just count the stars as a collective mass or a rough estimate. He calls them by name. He knows their individual constitution, their distance, their heat, their precise orbit.
And the implication is that the exact same individualized, granular attention he gives to the burning stars, he gives to a single sigh of a grieving person listening to this right now.
Precisely.
If he has a name for a ball of gas burning millions of light years away, he certainly has a precise, calculated understanding of the heartbreak you were experiencing in your living room. He has a ledger for the stars, and he has a bottle for your tears.
The commentators point out that God reverses the human order entirely. The same infinite mind that lifts the meek and binds their wounds is the mind that casts the wicked to the ground.
So his tenderness has actual teeth.
Yes. When he binds up a wound, it stays bound, because all the forces of the universe are at his disposal to ensure the safety of the outcast he has gathered.
So if God's infinite mind micromanages the distant stars, and his tender hands micromanage the hidden human heart, it begs the question, what about everything in between?
The messy middle.
Right. What about the wild, untamed, uninhabited parts of the earth where humans don't even exist? Does he care about the spaces where no one is looking? The text shifts its focus entirely to nature here, talking about God preparing rain, making grass grow in the mountains, and feeding the beasts and the young crying ravens.
This is where we get a massive injection of natural history from writers like Hugh Macmillan. He takes us away from human civilization entirely and brings us to the Swiss Alps.
Okay, the Swiss Alps.
Specifically, he looks at the Kuh and Schafalpen, the cow and sheep pastures situated high up on these desolate, freezing, treacherous mountain slopes.
Let's build the picture of these Alps for the listener, because these are not rolling, gentle green hills in the countryside.
Not at all.
These are brutal, sheer rock faces. The wind is freezing, the altitude is extreme, and it is a place completely hostile to human agriculture. No farmer is hiking up there with a tractor and a bag of fertilizer.
And yet, Macmillan points out that God irrigates these remote areas with absolute precision without any human cultivation. The ecosystem is meticulously balanced. Millions of cattle graze there in the summer, and the grass thrives.
Wow.
But Macmillan raises a biological problem. In an environment that delicate, how does the grass survive being eaten combined with the harsh condition?
Yeah, how does it?
He notes that God arranged for carnivorous insects to exist in those specific alpine pastures at a ratio 4 times higher than herbivorous insects.
Wait, carnivorous insects?
Yes, insects that eat other insects. If that specific mathematical check were not in place, the herb-eating insects would devour every single blade of mountain grass.
And then the cows would have nothing to eat.
Right. The cattle would starve, and the entire ecosystem would collapse into a barren rock face. God maintains the balance of a microscopic war between insects just to ensure the grass survives.
That is wild. He is orchestrating bug warfare to feed cows in a place no human lives.
It is wild. And the grass itself, Macmillan's observation about the biology of the alpine grass, completely blew my mind. He says the grass in these high mountains is viviparous.
Viviparous, let's break that down. Most plants produce seeds, right? The wind blows the seeds, they land in the dirt, and eventually they grow.
Normally, yes.
But on a jagged alpine cliff, if a blade of grass releases a tiny weightless seed, the freezing, violent mountain wind is going to blow it straight off the cliff and bury it in a glacier. It will perish. So what does this specific grass do?
Well, because the environment is so hostile to traditional reproduction, this viviparous grass skips the seed stage entirely.
It just skips it.
Yeah, it produces fully formed, miniature young plants right on the parent stalk. These tiny plants cling to the stem until they are heavy and developed.
Oh, wow.
Then the parent stalk withers and bends down to the earth, dropping the heavy, fully formed young plant directly into the soil where it immediately takes root. It bypasses the danger of the wind entirely.
Looking at that viviparous grass, a plant that produces fully formed clones of itself because the wind is too strong for seeds, I look at the modern scientific mind that wants to attribute all of this to blind secondary laws of nature.
Right, the typical evolutionary adaptation over millions of years.
Survival of the fittest, random mutations.
Yeah.
But the source material, and certainly the Reformed theological worldview, pushes back on that entirely, right?
Absolutely. The commentators, specifically a writer named G. Hubbard, address this directly. The Hebrews and the Puritans who exposition these texts had no concept of independent secondary laws that ran the universe on autopilot like a wound-up clock.
No autopilot.
No. They didn't view the clouds as sustained just by specific gravity, or the grass as adapting through blind chance. They saw God's immediate, efficient hand acting upon matter.
I think an analogy helps clarify the difference. Imagine walking into a massive, highly automated greenhouse.
Okay.
You see an intricate system of pipes adjusting the humidity based on the barometric pressure outside. You see mechanical arms deploying pest control at the exact ratio needed. You see a machine calculating the wind currents in the room and planting heavy seeds accordingly.
Like a high-tech facility.
Yeah. If you looked at all that and said, wow, look at how these pipes and machines just naturally adapted themselves over time to keep these plants alive, you would sound insane.
You really would.
You would know a genius engineer built the system, programmed the code, and actively maintains the power grid running it.
And that is the crucial point.
Yeah.
A law of nature is not an entity. It is simply the observed pattern of God's habitual action.
God's habitual action. I love that.
Right. When we say gravity pulls an object down, we are just describing the consistent way God actively moves matter. Recognizing the direct cause of nature's phenomena means seeing God's immediate hand in the viviparous grass adapting to the alpine wind. It is his engineering, not the grass's ingenuity.
The text then moves from the grass to the birds, specifically the ravens. We see observations from a naturalist named Gilbert White, who watched rooks gathering at dusk, cawing in a way that sounded almost liturgical, like evening prayers.
Yeah.
And J.G. Wood, who notes a brutal biological reality about young ravens. They apparently fall out of their nests heavily to the ground, croaking and utterly helpless before they can fly, yet the text says God ensures they are fed.
The raven is a significant choice of animal here.
Yep.
Under the Levitical law, the raven was an unclean bird. It is a scavenger. It is not a beautiful songbird or a noble eagle.
It's just a raven.
Yet God hears the cry of an unclean scavenger falling out of a tree. The theological implication is clear. If God bends his ear to the croak of an unclean, helpless bird, how much more will he listen to the cry of his own people when they are helpless?
Which perfectly sets up that brilliant anecdote about Edward Taylor, the sailor preacher of Boston.
Oh, that's a great story.
The story goes that he was praying before sailing for Europe, and he was agonizing over his congregation. He was stressing out, praying frantically about who would take care of his church, who would feed them spiritually, who would protect them while he was gone. He was carrying the entire weight of his church on his own shoulders.
Yeah, full of anxiety.
Exactly. But suddenly, he stops himself right in the middle of his prayer and rebukes himself. He says, "What have I done? Distrust the providence of heaven. A God that gives a whale a ton of herrings for a breakfast, will he not care for my children?"
It is an airtight, logical argument based on general providence. If God meticulously manages the oceanic food chain to ensure a whale gets a ton of herrings every single morning, and if he manages the insect ratios in the Alps to feed cows, the people of God are certainly secure. The anxiety Taylor felt was a result of him temporarily forgetting the staggering scale of the management system he was submitting to.
So if nature is completely dependent on God's sovereign provision, and if he is handling the whales, the ravens, and the grass, what is the proper posture for human beings? Because we don't act like the ravens. We try to rely on our own strengths.
We do.
The text addresses our human arrogance directly in verses 10 and 11. It says, God does not delight in the strength of the horse or the legs of a man. Instead, he takes pleasure in those who fear him and hope in his mercy.
This is a direct assault on everything our culture values. Society is utterly obsessed with the strength of the horse and the legs of a man. We idolize military might, physical athleticism, mental prowess, financial independence.
And absolute self-reliance.
Yes, we build entire educational and corporate systems around rewarding arrogant self-confidence. The message we receive every day is that you must be strong enough, smart enough, and capable enough to secure your own future.
Right. Believe in yourself.
Yeah.
You are enough. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. But the text says God actively rejects that mindset. He takes zero pleasure in our muscle, our brain power, or our independent capabilities.
Because relying on those things is an illusion. It is trying to be the engineer of the greenhouse instead of acknowledging you're the grass.
That's a great way to put it. The text says he only takes pleasure in this very specific dual posture, fear and hope.
The commentators, particularly Thomas Manton and Matthew Henry, provide a brilliant psychological and theological breakdown of this balance between fear and hope. To the modern mind, fear and hope seem like opposing forces.
Right, we think if you are afraid, you cannot be hopeful.
Exactly, and if you are hopeful, you shouldn't have any fear. But Manton and Henry argue they are entirely complementary. They are the two stabilizing forces of a healthy soul.
Let's unpack how they actually function, because this is intensely practical for the listener. How does fear work in this context? We aren't talking about a phobia, like being afraid of spiders, right?
Yeah. No, this is filial fear. A holy reverence and an acute awareness of God's holiness combined with an awareness of our own sinful tendencies. Manton explains that fear acts as a curb against sin.
A curb.
Yeah, a curb is the part of a bit used to control a horse. When the soul is tempted to run into presumption, arrogance, or independent rebellion, the fear of God pulls back on the reins. It shows you that God is a consuming fire, that he demands holiness, and that your own strength is fragile. Fear keeps you from flying off the cliff of pride.
But if you only have fear, you become paralyzed. You become terrified of making a mistake, and you view God as an abusive tyrant waiting to strike you down.
Which is why hope is the necessary counterweight. Manton says hope acts as a spur to duty.
Okay, the spur.
When the fear of your own inadequacy threatens to sink you into despair or lethargy, hope in God's mercy spurs you forward. Matthew Henry points out that a holy fear of God checks our hope so it doesn't become toxic presumption, while a pious hope in God checks our fear so it doesn't become crushing despair.
The text provides a fantastic tactile visual for this from George Seton Bowes. He says fear and hope are like the cork and the lead of a fisherman's net.
Oh, I love this analogy.
Imagine you are casting a net into the sea. If the net only has heavy lead weights attached to the bottom, the moment you throw it in, it sinks straight into the mud at the bottom of the ocean and becomes completely useless.
Right.
That is a soul overwhelmed by fear and legalism. It sinks into despondency. On the other hand, if the net only has corks attached to the top, it just floats on the surface of the water, drifting aimlessly with the wind. It never goes deep enough to catch anything. That is a soul with hope but no fear. It floats into trivial, shallow presumption.
The net only works, it only catches fish, when the lead pulls it down and the cork pulls it up simultaneously. The tension between the two holds the net perfectly open in the middle of the water. Maintaining this psychological balance is essential for spiritual health.
So to the person listening right now, walking through a high-stakes career, dealing with modern anxieties, constantly being told to cut off the lead weights and just float on their own self-esteem, how do they actively maintain this balance?
It requires a deliberate, daily submission to the truth of our own frailty. It means waking up and acknowledging, I do not have the strength of the horse or the legs of a man to save myself today.
That is the lead weight of fear.
Yes. But immediately following that with, however, the God who feeds the ravens and clothes the Alps has infinite mercy available for me. That is the cork of hope. When individuals adopt this posture, shifting their reliance off their own resume and onto God's character, the result is a corporate blessing.
Which leads us out of the individual psychological realm and into the corporate communal realm. Verses 12 through 14 expand the focus from the individual heart to the entire city of Jerusalem. God strengthens the bars of Jerusalem's gates, makes peace in her borders, and fills her with the finest of the wheat.
A commentator named William Nicholson gives 4 structured arguments for why this should produce immense praise: security, benediction, peace, and abundance. Let's examine that security. Strengthening the bars of the gates implies that there are enemies outside trying to get in. The city is not in a vacuum. It is in a hostile world.
Yeah.
But God acts as the divine security system.
But security alone is a miserable existence if you are starving. I look at it this way. A fortress is utterly useless if the people inside have no food. Imagine having a massive, impenetrable bank vault.
Okay.
The steel walls are 10 feet thick, the combination lock is uncrackable, and you are completely secure from any outside threat. But you are locked inside with absolutely nothing to eat or drink. You will survive the enemies, but you will die of starvation.
Right, that's a grim picture.
God doesn't just provide the external bars on the gates to keep the enemies out. He provides the finest, most satisfying nourishment within.
And the quality of that internal nourishment is vital. Johannes Paulus Palantarius, another commentator in the text, explains that while human leaders often distribute cheap, coarse commodities to the masses just to keep them quiet, God gives the most and best, the finest wheat.
The finest wheat.
In the Reformed tradition, this wheat is frequently interpreted spiritually. It represents the pure, unadulterated gospel truth, the nourishment of the scriptures, and in the end, Christ himself as the bread of life. The soul of the believer is not just protected from the wrath of God, it is fed with the highest quality of divine sustenance.
Thomas Watson, a famous Puritan writer, adds an interesting layer to the idea of peace within these borders. He compares this political and spiritual peace to the building of Solomon's temple, where no noise of a hammer or axe was heard during its construction.
Right, the stones were prepared beforehand.
Exactly. The stones were cut at the quarry, so the actual building site was silent. It represents a quiet, staggering stability that allows the inhabitants to thrive without constant alarm.
But the text is very honest. It doesn't pretend that God's provision always looks like warm sunshine, quiet temples, and golden wheat. Sometimes his blessings arrive wrapped in bitter, freezing cold.
And that brings us to what I think is the most surprising and frankly the most challenging section of the entire deep dive. We move from the warmth of the harvest into the winter of providence. Verses 15 through 17. It says, God gives snow like wool, scatters hoarfrost like ashes, and casts forth ice like morsels. Who can stand before his cold?
The scientific and spiritual paradox of snow like wool is thoroughly examined in the source material by writers like Hugh Macmillan and the physicist John Tyndall. To the naked eye, comparing freezing snow to warm wool makes no sense. But scientifically, the analogy is brilliant. Both snow and wool are terrible conductors of heat.
Meaning they trap heat inside rather than letting it escape.
Correct. Macmillan observes that snow acts as a literal blanket for the earth. During the harsh winter, the outside air temperature can drop far below freezing. If the soil were exposed directly to that air, the frost would penetrate deep into the ground and kill the dormant seeds and roots.
So the plants would die.
Yes. But God sends a thick layer of snow. The snow traps the latent heat of the earth underneath it, protecting the plant life from the freezing rigor of the atmosphere above. The text mentions the historical practice of Eskimos building huts of hardened snow, utilizing the very element of cold to protect themselves against the cold.
So the snow, which looks like death, is actually an incubator for life. Macmillan goes even further, pointing out the massive geological work of the glacial period. The secular winter, the massive sheets of ice that once covered continents, didn't just destroy.
No, they shaped the landscape.
Those glaciers crushed rocks, ground up minerals, and scooped out valleys to form the fertile plains of Europe. The ice was literally grinding the fertilizer for future civilizations.
But we must bridge this natural science to our spiritual reality. Because when you are the one enduring the winter, when you are the one getting crushed by the glacier, it is incredibly difficult to see it as a blessing.
I want to ask for clarification on this paradox, because this is where the theology meets the pavement for the listener.
Yeah.
How can something that inherently brings pain, loss, freezing cold, and isolation be the very instrument that preserves life?
That's the big question.
Let's use the analogy of a surgeon's scalpel. A scalpel is a terrifying instrument. It is razor sharp. When it is applied to human flesh, it cuts, it causes bleeding, it severs tissue, and it inflicts a trauma on the body.
Definitely.
If you just looked at the action of the scalpel, it looks like an act of violence. But in the hands of a skilled, compassionate surgeon, that violent wound is precisely what removes the malignant tumor and saves the patient's life. Are the commentators arguing that adversity acts as a glacial period in a person's life, carving out the landscape of the soul to hold more grace?
Yes, and they take it even further than just removing a tumor. They argue it prepares the soil for a harvest. Joseph Carroll and John Trapp, two commentators cited in the text, note that frost and ice are like morsels of bread.
It sounds completely counterintuitive to call ice bread.
It does, but they explain that the wintry cold is profitable to the earth. The freezing and thawing action breaks up the hard clods of dirt, kills off harmful pests in the soil, and fits the ground for bearing future harvests.
So the frost is quite literally preparing the ground to receive the seed.
Exactly. Adversity, chilling and blighting as it may feel to our personal ambitions or our comfort, has a protective and preparatory influence. It guards the soul against greater evils like the pestilence of pride, self-reliance, and worldly complacency. The freeze is entirely purposeful, and the text points out a critical pronoun. It asks, who can stand before his cold?
His cold.
Right, the cold doesn't come from a random, chaotic universe. It is his cold. He measured it, he sent it, and therefore he controls its duration.
That is massive. His cold. If you are going through a season of intense isolation, failure, or grief, a winter where nothing is growing and you feel buried, the text insists that this winter is not an accident.
Not at all.
It is not a sign that God has abandoned the thermostat of the universe. It is his cold, operating as a blanket and a plow to ensure you do not perish from spiritual pride. And because it is his cold, the freeze is purposeful. but it is never final. The cold always yields to the warmth of God's most spectacular gift, His Word.
This brings us to verses 18 through 20, the climax of the psalm. We see the thought of grace. He sendeth out his word and melteth them. He causeth his wind to blow and the waters flow. The deep freeze of winter is broken by two elements working together, the word and the wind.
Christopher Wordsworth provides a beautiful theological explanation of this thought. In the Reformed tradition, the Word and the Spirit, represented here by the wind, always cooperate in salvation.
Yes.
The frozen human heart, locked in the ice of its own sin and wholeness that we discussed earlier with Fenner, cannot melt itself. You cannot just decide to generate warmth in a freezing corpse.
Right, the Spirit of God must breathe upon the frozen heart.
Wordsworth says it is just as the vernal breeze melts the Arctic ice, causing streams of penitence and love to gush forth where before there was only rigid, unyielding frost.
This transition from the natural elements melting ice to the spiritual reality of God's word melting hearts brings the entire deep dive to its ultimate focal point. The massive distinction between general providence and special revelation.
Right, because up until this final section, we have been looking almost exclusively at general providence. God feeding the ravens, the mathematics of carnivorous alpine insects, the thermodynamics of snow, the grass dropping clones of itself.
All of that is available for anyone to observe in nature.
But now, the text shifts gears entirely. It says he shows his word to Jacob, dealing with Israel in a way he has not dealt with any other nation.
Thomas Watson, the Puritan we mentioned earlier, makes this distinction exceptionally clear. He notes that while the heathen nations have the light of nature, they can look up and see the stars, they can feel the snow, they can observe the grass, that natural light is insufficient for salvation.
It's just not enough.
General revelation proves that a creator exists, that he is powerful, and that he is orderly. But it cannot tell you how to be reconciled to him. Believers, however, have the blessed book to resolve all doubts and point out the way of life.
Let's use an analogy to draw a sharp line between these two types of revelation. General revelation, looking at nature, the Swiss Alps, the Hubble telescope, is like walking down the street and admiring a beautifully constructed, massive mansion from the sidewalk. You can look at the stonework, the slope of the roof, the reinforced glass, and the manicured gardens. By observing the house, you know without a shadow of a doubt that a genius architect and builder exists. You can deduce his intelligence and his power, but you cannot know his name, you cannot know what he loves, and you cannot know if he wants you to come inside just by looking at the bricks.
And that is the limit of natural theology. It leaves you on the sidewalk.
But special revelation, the scriptures, the word sent to Jacob, is the architect himself walking out the front door, walking down to the sidewalk, taking you by the hand and inviting you inside the house.
Oh, that's beautiful.
He sits you down at his dining table, tells you his name, explains his redemptive plans for history, and tells you how you can be adopted into his family. You cannot get that from looking at a raven or studying a snowflake. You can only get that if he chooses to speak.
Watson describes this special revelation as sovereign, electing grace in its fullest noontide. The surrounding nations were covered with the darkness of paganism, but Israel sat in the light of divine truth. God did not owe this special revelation to anyone. He was not obligated to write a book,
Right.
which makes the gift of his statutes and judgments an act of pure, unmerited mercy. He gave them the law to break their hearts and the gospel to heal them.
And that intimate invitation, that staggering grace of the architect opening the door, is exactly why the psalm begins and ends with the exact same word, hallelujah. When you recognize that the God who commands the blizzards and numbers the billions of galaxies has also chosen to stoop down, reveal his mind, bandage your specific wounds, and speak directly to you through his word, the only rational, logical response for a human being is continuous, overwhelming praise.
The consistency of his character is what makes this text so striking. Whether we observe him through the macro lens of cosmic sovereignty, watching him name the stars, or through the micro lens of intimate healing, watching him gather the discarded outcasts of society, his meticulous care remains perfectly balanced.
He's not a chaotic deity.
Not at all.
Yeah.
He is the sovereign Lord who manages the universe and the human soul with the exact same level of infinite precision.
So as we wrap up this massive scope of source material, I want to pull all these threads together for you, the listener. You have been shown a God who commands the galaxies and the brutal winter blizzards. But he is the same God who bends down to feed the young, unclean raven crying in the dirt.
Yeah.
He is the architect who intentionally goes to the scrap heap to gather outcasts and ruins to build his eternal city. He is the physician who uses the hammer of the law to break your dangerous illusion of self-righteousness, only so he can use the gospel to bind up your wounds. He sends the freezing, isolating snow to protect the soil of your soul and prepare it for the finest wheat.
And he does all of this not as a distant clockmaker, but as an active, immediate presence, orchestrating the ecosystem of your life just as deliberately as Shual. He orchestrates the carnivorous insects in the Alps.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to mull over as we close. We spent a lot of time talking about Hugh McMillan's observation of that viviparous grass high up in the freezing, uninhabited Swiss Alps, a plant that God engineered to drop fully formed clones of itself so it wouldn't be blown away by the wind.
Such a specific design.
Right. If God expends such flawless, intricate, genius engineering on a tiny patch of grass, on a jagged cliff in a place no human eye might ever see, a place that offers him nothing in return, what hidden, unobserved provisions is he making right now in the harsh, freezing, unseen corners of your own life? What mechanisms of grace has already put in place in your blind spots to ensure that the wind of your current adversity does not blow you off the cliff? Keep asking the hard questions, keep looking intensely at the text, and we will see you next time on Reformed Thinking.